All right, our first installment at our look at Islam, the third of the monotheistic religions we're looking at here, and the third of the so-called big three, or kind of religions of the book, or Abrahamic religions. Our look today, part one, our look at Islam. So of course, Islam is synonymous, or the origins of Islam are synonymous with the figure of Muhammad, of course. But I think it's a bit of a misnomer, or at least kind of a slight misunderstanding, when you hear a phrase like Muhammad is the founder of Islam, or kind of the creator of a new religion. And I would say that's partially true, but also misleading. And so, when we talk about Islam as one of the religions of the book, as an Abrahamic religion, I think it's important to understand that kind of Orthodox Islam considers that Muhammad, as a prophet, was not creating something entirely new. He wasn't founding a kind of a brand new religion, but from a traditional historical point of view, he was calling the people back of the Arabian Peninsula back to the true religion, back to the worship of one God, back to a true monotheism, which in many ways is rooted in that same tradition shared by Judaism and Christianity. So we'll explore this a little bit, but I think that's important to understand that Muhammad himself likely did not see himself as someone bringing something new in terms of a brand new religion to the people. Now, his revelation that he claims to have received was a new one, and believed by Muslims to be the final and most perfect of revelations from God. But it's all pointing back to a religion that was there before, and like so many of those Old Testament prophets in the Jewish and Christian tradition, Muhammad saw himself as a one in a link of a chain of these prophets, calling people back, as prophets did, to belief in the one true God. And so we'll detail this. We'll kind of talk about kind of the origins of Islam. We'll talk about what we know about Muhammad, who he was, and what the world was like into which he was born. He was born in the latter part of the 6th century CE. So compared to Judaism and Christianity, it is comes along much later. So about almost 600 years after the time of Jesus. It also plays this very important role in terms of keeping as I have here, the torch of civilization and knowledge alive in the West. And so while Europe is plunging into what's sometimes called the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages, right around the time Muhammad is born, that's the time where Islam arises, and it does indeed establish this this intellectual tradition, and keeps alive a lot of those Greek and Roman texts and ideas that went underground or were lost in the Western world, but is kept alive by a burgeoning Islamic intellectual tradition. And one of the things we'll notice about Islam is that it kind of by design, kind of at its root, it's very, very simple. The famous creed, there is no God but God, and Muhammad is his messenger. To profess that publicly and to believe it in your heart is to become a Muslim. There's no need for kind of intricate initiation ceremonies and the like. It is at its core a simple religion. I should say, at a glance, but of course, no religion that grows and expands and over the various continents and through the minds and mouths of many believers and teachers and writers is anything but simple. And so, of course, Islam takes on many different forms, many subtleties, profound differences lie beneath that sheen of simplicity. But in its beginning, what it seems to be is Muhammad was calling people away from kind of the wild, dizzying complexity of polytheism that kind of ruled the day in the Arabian Peninsula that he was born into, and he was calling people back to kind of a simplicity, a belief in the one true God, and wiping the slate clean from all these competing polytheistic voices that were out there. Today, you'll often hear this stat, and there's no reason to doubt it. It's the fastest growing world religion. About a fifth of humanity is subscribed to some aspect of Islam, about 1.3. I've also seen estimates up to 1.6 billion people on the planet out of a total population, global population of about 8 billion. The heart of the Islamic world today, you'll find Muslims all over the world, of course, but the heart of the Islamic world is very much as it was during its 6th and 7th century heyday. It's kind of the heart, of course, the holiest city in Islam is Mecca. Um, this is the area around which Muhammad was born, and was considered to be a kind of a house of worship of the one true God long before Muhammad comes along and calls the people back to it. Mecca and Medina here in Saudi Arabia, often called the first and second most holiest sites in Islam. But then after the death of Muhammad, it spreads very rapidly across North Africa and up and through the Middle East and into parts of Asia, as we see here. And the color codes represent kind of the major kind of fundamental doctrinal split in Islam. Generally speaking, if you are a Muslim, you tend to be a Sunni, or you tend to be a Shia. The vast majority, I think it's something like 80% of Muslims around the world would consider themselves Sunni, and about 20% Shia. And you can see by the map here, the vast majority of Shia or Shiite Muslims live in the country that we call Iran today. And Iran today is an the Islamic Republic, as they call it, run by Shiite mullahs and ayatollahs there. We'll talk more about kind of what does that exactly mean. There's lots of complexities. It's not to say that all Sunnis believe the same kind of thing. It's lots of branches underneath Sunni, and in fact, it's fascinating. Under the banner of Sunni, you'll find probably the most liberalized Muslims, the most integrated into kind of secular Western world Muslims, but you also find the most kind of fundamentalist, violent forms of Islam under Sunni as well. So we'll explore that a bit later. Now, we were talking about its connection to Abraham and to kind of the Jewish and Christian traditions, and Abraham is considered by Muslims to be a fundamental patriarch, but whereas Jews and therefore also Christians trace kind of the promise of God and the covenant with God passing from Abraham to his son Isaac. Muslims say no, the promise is traced through Ishmael. So if you remember, in the Jewish tradition, Abraham has a child with his concubine Hagar, because in the Jewish point of view, he's desperate to produce a male heir to pass on his legacy and his wealth. And Sarah, his main wife, seems to be unable to have children, and so he has a child with Hagar, Ishmael. In the Jewish tradition, Abraham, the promised child, is Isaac, who eventually is born to Abraham and Sarah, and Ishmael becomes kind of second class in that. But in the Islamic tradition, Ishmael is the one that carries on the promise. And so in the Islamic tradition, Abraham travels down with Hagar and Ishmael to the area which will become Mecca in the Arabian Peninsula, and it's there that he builds the first house of worship, which in Islamic tradition is the first place where God is worshipped as one. There's another tradition that's also thought, but why go down to the Arabian Peninsula? Well, there was a tradition that's where Adam and Eve were reunited after being kicked out of the Garden of Eden, and having spent some time apart, they reunite at Mecca and live there. And so and then Abraham and Ishmael come along later and build what's called the Kaaba, which is Arabic for cube. And there is built a simple stone building in which God was worshipped as a single God, a monotheistic God, for the very first time. And that too, that Kaaba, in Islamic tradition, that's the structure that's at the center of the Great Mosque in Mecca. It's still kind of an object of pilgrimage and a locus for worship and adoration for Muslims today. I'll show you some pictures in just a moment. So the idea is that there in that area of Mecca, God is worshipped as one for the first time. But over the years, over the hundreds, over the thousands of years, the people of Arabia eventually turned away from that Abrahamic true religion. They turned to vice, they turned to violence, and they turned to worshiping the many, many gods and goddesses of their neighbors. So it's a very similar kind of story that you see in the Jewish scriptures, is that Jerusalem, the temple is built for God as the prime house of worship, but over time the Jewish people turn away and they start to worship the gods of their neighbors, and the prophets have to come along and come them back. The Islamic story is very much in the same vein. Here's a photograph of the Kaaba as it looks today. It's this, you can see it's a cube, and it's thought that the foundations here go all the way back to that Abrahamic building here. The upper reaches of it are much more come much later. It's covered by this large black velvet cloth, and this is the courtyard of the great mosque at Mecca during the time of the Hajj, the annual pilgrimage. You can see it's packed with pilgrims, worshippers, and during the Hajj they will walk around the Kaaba and perform rituals of prayer and adoration. And this is a massive courtyard. It can hold hundreds of thousands of worshippers at once. But this is kind of ground zero for Islamic belief in Allah, the one God. And so it's important to remember that this cube there in Islamic tradition was there long before Muhammad comes along. And so when Muhammad comes along, he's coming into a Mecca that's filled with many gods and goddesses, and his radical idea is to, like the thundering prophets in the Jewish tradition, is to call the people back to the true worship, back to the Kaaba, as it were. So today, inside it's a very simple structure. It's just roughly kind of a cube-shaped room held up by a few pillars. In one of the corners of the outside, the tradition is that kind of the cornerstone of the Kaaba was a meteorite sent from heaven that was originally blazing white, but over the years has turned black because of the stain of sin of humanity. Here's a photograph from what it looks like inside. It's, as I understand it, it's not like this holy of holies that's completely off limits. It's not as if anybody can walk into it, but it's, again, the simplicity of the structure is meant to reflect kind of that simplicity of Islamic doctrine. There is no God but God, and Muhammad is his messenger. Believe that, and you are a Muslim. You'll see on the Blackboard site, I linked just a short video called "The History of Makkah," which is another just alternate spelling of Mecca, that tells in an animation kind of the story of the Kaaba in a really succinct and interesting kind of way. It's definitely a pro-Islam video. Not in kind of a proselytizing kind of way, but I thought it have a look at it because I think it tells this story in a very digestible and interesting kind of way. Now, what do we know about Muhammad himself? Well, not a ton. Born around the year 570, and we know that he was born into wealth, and also born into tradition. And so, what did wealth mean in the Arabian Peninsula in the 6th century? Well, it looked very much kind of like an Abrahamic existence. Wealth was measured in how large your flocks were, how large your caravan was. And so wealth wasn't necessarily based in the cities, but you traveled around with your caravan and you followed the seasons. You went where the water was, you went where the rain was, you went where the grasslands were to feed your flocks. And the larger your caravan, the higher your status and the bigger your wealth. And that seems to have been the case that Muhammad was born into a very wealthy tribe that had wealth invested in these kinds of ways. Now, he also was born into a family that had links to the Kaaba. In Islamic tradition, Muhammad's great-grandfather was also a powerful clan chief and was a caretaker for that house of worship, which was still there, but was now surrounded by the temples and altars of many gods and goddesses. And so the tradition says that as Muhammad was brought up in this family, he was going to inherit the family business. He was being trained, he was being groomed to take over the caravans as a wealthy shepherd, as oxymoronic as that might sound to us. Now things change for him. So goes the story. And I should say that throughout this, there's not a lot of hard history about Muhammad. There's lots of this tradition. Nothing is really written down at the time. So we've inherited these traditions, and there's lots of question about how historical these things are. So I'm sharing with you kind of the most accepted tradition. Age 25, he marries an older, a wealthy, and very intelligent woman by all accounts, Khadijah, and in a marriage that was to cement connections, political, economic connections between wealthy families. But it's Khadijah who recognized that there's more going on with Muhammad than that perhaps he's even recognized. She sees that her husband has these spiritual gifts. He has these visions. He has a way of seeing the world. And she's the one who really pushes him to pursue this. This is, there might be more to your life than just managing these caravans. And so around age 40, he goes on this retreat during the month of Ramadan by the Islamic calendar, and this is why the month of Ramadan is a sacred month for Muslims, for fasting and for reconnecting spiritually. It's during this month he goes up into the mountains, and he has a number of these experiences with the angel Gabriel, the same Gabriel from the Jewish and Christian traditions, and he's the one who tells him to recite, to write, and he becomes the vessel. Muhammad becomes the vessel through which the angel gives him the first words of what ultimately becomes the Quran, which, according to Orthodox Muslim belief, is the last and final and best revelation that came from God. Here are the opening lines of the Quran, translated again from the Arabic into English. In the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful. All praise is due to Allah, Lord of the universe, the most gracious, the most merciful, owner of the day of judgment. You alone do we worship, and you alone we turn to for help. Guide us to the straight path, the path of those on whom you have bestowed your grace, not the way of those who have earned your anger, nor of those who went astray. I've highlighted and bolded those last words because I think those speak to kind of the historical context that Muhammad found himself in. That here he is. Here we have the prophet calling the people back. Don't follow. God will bless those who have stayed on the right path, and He will punish those who have gone astray. Return to the straight path. Return to the worship of Allah, the one true God, not these other false deities. So Muhammad, within these years, or not, after he receives this revelation, he starts to preach this message. But he, like all prophets, he faces resistance, and brutal resistance. Nobody wants to hear this message. Nobody wants to receive this call back, and he's at the point of kind of giving it all up. This is going nowhere. And he doubts himself. Is he on the wrong path? And it's at the height of these trials that he experiences this out of body experience. Now, as I understand it, Muslims different groups will interpret this differently. But he has this experience, which is usually referred to as the night of ascension. And some Muslims believe it as kind of a physical, bodily journey of Muhammad, where he's taken up from Jerusalem up into the heavens, and there he's given this otherworldly vision of the world and of God and the prophets, and it's there that Allah sets him alongside the other prophets. Says, no, this is your mission. You are doing what you are supposed to do. Other Muslims think of it more as kind of a spiritual, almost dreamlike experience. But at the end, the punch is the same. When he emerges from this experience, he is emboldened, and he knows that he's on the right path there. And so it's also this time where Muhammad starts gaining enough followers that Islam becomes just by kind of default, a political force, a military force, as much as a spiritual, religious force. He takes his followers from the city of Mecca, from the city of the Kaaba, north to Medina, and there Muhammad sets up camp. Now as a political and military leader, as well as a spiritual leader. So you see by this map here. So Mecca down here, in kind of the south west corner of what we call Saudi Arabia today, and then almost directly north, you have the city of Medina. And so it's where Mecca is where the belief of Allah began with the Hagar and Abraham and Ishmael, and this is where Muhammad's calling the people back to, but he's kind of pushed out this idea that a prophet is rejected by his hometown, and he goes up to Medina. It's in Medina that Islam becomes a political force, and also becomes more kind of a doctrinal, more kind of organized religion, you might call it. And so in the year 630, so Muhammad's about 60 years old now. Muhammad and his followers, they're powerful enough to march on Mecca, a key moment in the history of Islam. And they take the city, and the accounts suggest that it's a bloodless victory. The people of Mecca see them coming. They see that they're outnumbered. They recognize the spiritual power on the side of these people, and they open the doors and allow them in. And so the first order of business was to purge the Kaaba and its surroundings of the idols of these other gods and return it to the worship of Allah. And so then Mecca is taken as the spiritual center of this burgeoning religion. And Medina, the city north, maintains its reputation as the political and kind of doctrinal center of Islam. And it's just a couple years after that, Muhammad dies, and we see the first major split in this religion happening on the heels of that. He dies, and without naming a successor of sorts. And again, if you know your kind of Jewish tradition, generally speaking, prophets don't name successors. That's not how it works. God calls out prophets when they're needed, and so this gap leads to a problem. Who's going to inherit this mantle? It's not just a spiritual movement now. Now it's a military movement. It's a political movement. Who's going to govern this? And there's disagreement. Some say that his right hand man, Abu Bakr, who does become kind of the first official caliph, kind of a term for a kind of a political leader of Islam. Some say that he was kind of, if anyone was groomed to do this, it was Abu Bakr. But others say, no, it should stay in the family. And so others say that Ali, who was Muhammad's son-in-law and married to his favorite daughter Fatima, that is kind of the role should stay with the family. And that disagreement sets up a split that survives to this day. So Sunni Muslims, going way back, recognize that Abu Bakr was the legitimate first caliph and inheritor of the mantle of Muhammad, and Shiites say no, Ali was the proper heir. In part 2 of this, we'll explore this kind of divide later, and what exactly does that mean, and how Sunnis and Shiites differ. But this split goes way back to the very beginnings of Islam. Now, within not long, it's incredible how rapidly Islam spreads. And it spreads mainly by the sword. So when Muhammad dies, most of the Arabian Peninsula here, or kind of most of what we would call Saudi Arabia today, was kind of under the influence and governance of Muhammad and Islam. But after his death, and kind of these two waves, so within, because you can see by the dates here, Muhammad dies in 632. By 750, so less than 120 years after Muhammad's death, which in the grand scheme of things is not that long of a time. You can see by the arrows and the color schemes here, Islam spreads very rapidly, kind of bullets across North Africa and up into the Mesopotamia, into the Near East, and quickly kind of takes over, pushing into Spain here. And again, eventually the Muslims are pushed out of Spain, but Islam pushes into Turkey, ultimately takes over Constantinople, and threatens kind of the remaining holds of Christendom, the remaining holds of the Roman Empire, which had become Christianized by this point. The advance is really rapid, and like I said in that earlier slide, kind of the heart of the Islamic world today is still the heart of the Islamic world as we look at maps today, kind of the Arabian Peninsula, North Africa, and parts here of Mesopotamia and the Middle East. All right, that's the end of part 1, and I'll talk to you guys soon.